Okay, so I just wanted to start by saying how much I've really been enjoying this symposium and to thank the organizers very much for their incredible efficiency in putting it together. This is complicated with all these different streams and things, and I'm just incredibly impressed. So thank you very much. So I'm going to dive straight in. So this is more like a kind of framework talk, and I'm hoping that it will be useful for the people that are following on from me who are talking about climate change specifically. And I'm going to focus on these four questions. So first, I'm going to look at some of the effects of climate change on wild animals. And here I'm going to think about wild animals both as members of whole species and as individual sentient animals. And by sentient, I mean animals that can have experiences, like experiences of pain and pleasure. And I'm also going to take it that if they can suffer, they matter. Then I'm going to think about, I hadn't really thought about this before, so this was an interesting question, whether climate change could be called a disaster for wild animals, either as whole species or as individuals or both. And then if it is a disaster, why that might matter ethically. So I'm going to look at several different ethical arguments as to why we might be concerned about climate change. And then finally, I'll think about possible responses in terms of policy and practice with respect to climate change and why these are potentially pretty complicated to think about. Okay, so I'm sure everyone here, and we've already talked about some of these things, is familiar with key impacts of climate change. So warming temperatures, melting ice, sea level rise, extreme weather, increased number and intensity of wildfires. And obviously these are having significant impacts on species on species populations and on habitats. So there's changing food supply, changing access to water, new threats from fire, as we've seen, new threats from flood, and extreme heat and drought. Now, I think it's important to note that many species are responding to this. So at the moment, a third of species, it's been estimated, are currently shifting their territories, changing their times of migration, changing their times of reproduction, changing their behaviors. So they're doing things like foraging at night when it's cooler. And some species already seem to be evolving in response to climate change. And that adaptability means that some species will be able to survive and some will even be able to thrive under conditions of climate change. But not all species, of course, can do that. And we've already seen lots of examples of that. And in conjunction with other human threats, it's been estimated that up to 1/6 of all species may become extinct by 2100 at the kind of worst estimates of climate change, so 4.3 degrees centigrade. So I've been thinking about species, but of course we can also think about these climate effects through individual animals too. And so here the concern is not so much with extinction or evolution, but with the possible impact on animal welfare and animal lives. So while some animals are able to adapt and even exploit climate change, obviously that's not true of lots of them. But I did just want to flag up that I think sometimes, it's very easy to think of animals as being sort of all helpless victims in the context of climate change, but also some of them are able to be actors and to kind of respond in a more positive way to the changes that are happening. But having said this, of course, many animals have already been killed by climate change and many more will die. Many will suffer from diseases and parasite infestations, malnutrition, thirst, loss of territory, inability to carry out natural behaviors, and so on. And so, although a few animals will do fine, climate change is making and will make many animals' welfare worse. Okay, so that's a sort of very brief overview in terms of my first question. The second question was, could these effects be called a disaster for wild animals? So I had never really looked, I confess, at the disaster literature before. So this was very interesting for me to do. And there's obviously a lot of differences. Disaster seems to be a kind of contested word. And actually, I really like what the last speaker said about, well, maybe the disaster is just the way we treat animals in general. But when you look at the definitions of disaster across the human literature, the things that kind of bind those definitions together are the idea that disaster should be thought of as being large scale and across whole communities, and that they overwhelm the ability of those communities to respond and adapt to them. And given that description, if we apply it to ecological communities and whole species, I think climate change can reasonably be described as a disaster for lots of those communities where they are being overwhelmed by the impacts of things like fire and floods. I'm kind of uncertain as to what I think about some kinds of changes. So where, for instance, you have a tundra that's changing to a forest, whether you would describe that as a kind of disaster for the species that are there. So maybe we could talk about that later, but I certainly think there are lots of cases where we can say that. And more colloquially, I think we can also talk about climate change as being a disaster for individuals, some individuals. So as we've seen in terms of the flooding cases that people have talked about, clearly for those animals that were caught up in there, it was a disaster for them. So I think it's right to say that, yes, climate change is a disaster for at least some individuals and species. So now onto the kind of the bulk of my argument. How might a disaster matter ethically? What are the ethical concerns here? So I want to start by thinking about species values. And I think this is important because it's something that lots of people think about more probably than they think about individual animals. And there are lots of reasons why people are concerned about the loss of species. And I think that those are good, important reasons. That species can be hugely important in the ways that we think about why places matter in terms of aesthetic values. So the pictures here, one is of the Hawaiian honeycreeper, which is a group of species actually that's being threatened by climate change because avian malaria is becoming more prevalent higher up in the mountains as Hawaii is warming. And it's a culturally important bird in Hawaii. And then there are other birds like the king penguins, which are kind of charismatic species that are part of the way that we think about what the Antarctic's like as a place. And they're also being threatened because the food supply is moving further away from their nesting areas. So there are these kinds of cultural and aesthetic values and ways that we think about place that are being threatened by climate change. This is about humans, of course, but human values are important as well. Then there are the ecological values that species extinctions might damage. So particular species are often really important to the functioning of particular ecosystems. And the continued functioning of ecosystems matters obviously not just to people, but also to the wild animals themselves. And in addition, many people argue that the continuing existence of wild animal species is important intrinsically. So independently of how they make us feel or the services they provide us, these species have intrinsic value. And some environmental ethicists have developed that argument further and argue that species are the kinds of things that we can talk about being harmed and benefited. And so they argue that if you can harm and benefit something, we could think of it as potentially being morally considerable, so it matters in itself. So there are lots of reasons why climate disaster in terms of species extinction can be seen as highly problematic ethically. But the concerns I think of most people here are really about individual animals. And here I want to divide the concerns into two. And this is one of the things that's actually been really interesting listening to what people have been saying so far. So one reason you might be worried about climate change in terms of individual animals is that it causes suffering. And suffering, many people argue, is intrinsically bad. And where we can relieve suffering, if we can do so, we should do so, as long as our attempts to relieve the suffering don't make the suffering worse overall. Now, that kind of argument seems to be central here, but of course it applies to all kinds of wild animal suffering, not just suffering caused by people. So on this view, there's no particular distinction between natural and human-caused disasters. The goal is just to reduce suffering overall, especially where it's intense and prolonged. And so when you're thinking about responding to climate change, you'd also need to think about responding to other kinds of wild animal suffering. But there's also a second kind of argument here, which is more specific, and it applies to those animals particularly harmed by climate change, because climate change is anthropogenic, it's caused by people. So this is an argument about injustice. So the thought here is that humans are responsible for climate change. And of course, some humans are more responsible than others. And I'm not going to particularly comment on that, but that is obviously significant. And humans have benefited from the use of fossil fuels that have led to greenhouse gas emissions. And we've known for some time that the effects of our emissions, including on wild animals, are negative. And we've had choices to change what we do, but we haven't done so. And so humans have moral responsibility for the harms climate change is causing to wild animals. And many ethicists want to put that in the framework of justice and say that these effects are unjust to animals because they've been harmed and caused to suffer. And they, of course, haven't benefited at all from greenhouse gas emissions, particularly say that about wild animals. And so unlike the suffering reduction view, so like the first view A above, here, what matters is that humans have caused climate change. And so while we may have some responsibilities to relieve suffering in general, we should prioritize the kinds of suffering that have been caused by human beings. And some people here argue that just as climate change can be a human rights violation, we could also perhaps think of it as an animal rights violation. And so that takes me to my last point, which is a kind of big set of questions about, okay, well, if we have these responsibilities, what should we do about them? What are our ethical responsibilities with respect to climate change impacts? Now, obviously, the first thought one might have is, well, we could just stop harming them by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, I don't disagree with that, but it seems like it's a long-term global strategy, and it's going to be too slow to help wild animals and wild animal species in the near or even the medium-term future. These disasters are already happening. And it's for this reason, I think, that most of the people working in ethics in this area are really thinking about what they call adaptive assistance. So strategies to help wild animals, either as species, so conservationists are really concerned with wild animal species, or as individuals, as the people concerned about animal welfare and so on are thinking about helping them to cope with climate change. And I think some of what's coming on the upcoming papers has been about that, as well as some of the previous papers. But one difficulty here is that there are going to be complex trade-offs in practice, and that some different ethical approaches, so ones that focus on species, for instance, may support different kinds of adaptive strategies. And so there are going to be difficult choices to make about what actually we're going to do. So I wanted to say a bit more about that. So this is getting down to the more practical level. So there's a lot of different ways in which it's been proposed that we could help animals suffering from climate change, and that we have some ethical responsibility to do so. And this is just a very brief list of some of the things that might happen. And traditionally, the main way that people have thought about doing this is by, setting aside land to protect animals from things that humans are doing to them. But in the context of climate change, as we've seen, setting land aside is not going to protect them, because that land will still flood, it will still get very hot. The climate's going to change even in wilderness areas. So that doesn't seem like it's necessarily going to help in the context of climate change. So other kinds of things that one might do is try to reduce other threats to those animals. So if they're hunted, for instance, you could reduce the amount of hunting that's happening. If they're suffering from pollution, you could pollute less. You could create new habitat. So if fresh water is becoming salt water, freshwater marshes are becoming saltwater areas, wetlands by the coast, you could create new wetlands. You could rescue animals from extreme weather, and we've just seen a paper about trying to help animals in the context of flooding. And then there are these even more kind of interventionist ideas. So using genetics to try to boost animals' resilience in the context of climate change, providing them with extra water, food, shelter, and so on in the wild areas where they are, or moving populations to new habitat where the climate is more suitable. So if the climate's changing where they are, put them somewhere else. But these very interventionist strategies do raise some complex issues in practice. So the last thing I want to talk about is a couple of examples of why I think this is so potentially complicated. So one case that's been talked about a good deal in the literature is the case of polar bears. So polar bears, obviously, they live in the Arctic where the ice is melting. And polar bears generally hunt seals off sea ice. But in the summer, there's no sea ice for them in some parts of their range. So those populations tend to come onto the land and they don't eat. They tend to fast or they just scavenge until the ice comes back and then they go back on the ice. The worry is that 1 year soon, the ice is going to form too late and the bears will become malnourished or they'll starve, with a threat both to species populations and threatening, obviously, individuals with suffering and death. So one strategy that's been proposed is feeding bears until they can get back on the ice. And at first sight, you might think, well, that could potentially protect species populations. It might reduce the suffering of the bears that are hungry. And perhaps it's a way of beginning to repair injustices that the bears are suffering because of climate change. But when you start thinking about doing this in more detail, there are lots of different kinds of problems that this raises. First, feeding wild animals, as I'm sure most of you know, can go wrong. The bears might fight each other. They might spread disease at feeding site centers. They might lose the ability to feed themselves over time. And then there's the question about what you're actually feeding them on, because these bears are highly carnivorous and they live on seals. So would the humans be killing the seals to feed the bears? Does that potentially raise new injustice issues? Or would you feed them the chow made from fish and pork that polar bears eat in zoos? But that raises, obviously, its own ethical issues. So it's possible that feeding the bears might create more suffering for other animals. And in addition, there are worries both about the loss of the wildness of bears and their kind of autonomy, their ability to live their own lives once humans start feeding them. So assisting polar bears in the context of being hungry seems to involve lots of different kinds of value trade-offs between different animals' lives and welfare, their wildness and their autonomy, and as well, actually, in this case, human safety and welfare too. So it's very unclear what to do, and you'd have to make trade-offs between different kinds of values. And then the last case I wanted to talk about is the case of the American pika. So this is a well-known species in the United States. These are little small mammals that are found in high altitude in the American West, and they're super sensitive to heat. They don't like to live in temperatures over 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And climate change means they're risking suffering and premature death. So one possibility that's been proposed in the scientific literature is moving these pika further north into mountains in Canada where they're going to be cooler. And that it's argued would help to protect the species, as well as potentially helping some individuals. But again, this raises lots of questions. As I said before, lots of the reasons why people value species are related to the place that they're in. If you move species to another place, you're going to lose some of the values of the species, and you're putting them in new ecosystems where they may potentially not contribute or even potentially harm those systems. So there are those kinds of worries. Would it reduce suffering? Well, it might reduce suffering over time. If it was the case that you moved some pika and then you created new happy, healthy pika populations in the new location, then over time you probably would reduce suffering. But because pika are so sensitive, in the process of moving them, many of them are likely to die and to suffer. And so you'd have some near-time suffering in order to gain far-term happiness. So you'd have to sort of trade off suffering over time. But if you are worried about climate change as injustice, inflicting more suffering on pika that are already threatened by climate change in order to make some happy pika in the future seems potentially to increase the injustice for those pika that you're actually moving. So in this kind of case, it's likely that different ethical approaches would agree. So if you're worried primarily about species value, you may think it's a good idea to move pika up to a point. If you're worried about reducing suffering over time, you may think it's worth moving pika. But if you're worried about injustice, the injustice of climate change, you may think you shouldn't harm the existing pika further in order to make some happy pika in the future. So this is just to suggest how complicated these kinds of ethical decisions are, where you're trying to shape your kind of policy response to climate change based on different sorts of ethical principles. So I'd just like to end with this quotation, which is actually from the paper by the polar bear scientists who are talking about how to respond to starvation amongst polar bears. And they say it's critical to contemplate and discuss options ahead of the need to respond. Although some of the topics may seem radical, future conditions may well be outside the range of past circumstances and necessitate very different actions than today. The success of interventions will be partly determined by the degree of advanced planning. So essentially, we really need to think about all the different ethical concerns and values that are at stake when we're thinking about future policies to respond to animals affected by climate change. So thank you.